Okay, so thank you for joining us tonight for our discussion. We're going to finish going over the guidelines, and then we're going to move into the Regional Housing Authority. So just a recap. So we've had some very productive meetings. The last two joint work sessions, the City Council and BOCC have given us great direction on the community guidelines. That was March 28th. And then the creation of the Regional Housing Authority on April 21st. We want to make sure that we thank the Housing Coalition for all of their hard work that brought us to this point. We would not be where we are today without all of your hard work in getting us here. So thank you. So we're making great strides. We have consensus on the lottery processes, the essential worker definition, which we did add the child care providers to that, the 2% appreciation cap, resale and rental procedures, and permitted and unpermitted capital improvements. And many of the elected officials have stated the need to take care of Lake County employees. Lake County, that was supposed to say Lake County based employees. For some reason it does not. Anyway, so the AMI limits up to 200% continue to be the final point of contention. So we're going to go through that. So here are the tiers. The special, this is not the right, it's missing your, this is not the right.
No, this is the one we've been presenting so far. This doesn't have the edit.
It doesn't have the stuff that you had it, that you changed. We didn't
change it.
Okay. So the tiers, these are the tiers that we've been presenting all along that you got in the email and that are also in your documents today. So the tier 1 is special right of first refusal. Tier 2, Lake County based employee making 200% AMI or less. And that is just as an illustration. You also have in your packet of papers in front of you the 2021 Lake County area median income table. So you can refer to that if you have any questions regarding that. But 200% AMI, if we were looking at a 2-person household, and the example that I want to throw out there is the teachers just got their raises. They are making, the average teacher is making $57,000. And so 2 teachers together are making $114,000. So at 200% AMI, they're just coming in at 190% for that household. Tier 3, Lake County resident of 4 years or more making 120% AMI or less, 2 people at $70,560 for 2021. That would be their salary with the 2 of them. And then tier 4, Lake County resident of 4 years or more making 120% to 200% AMI. And that is a range for 1 person of $61,800 to $103,000. And then tier 5 is any other permanent Lake County resident. This is not the right one.
Yeah, this isn't the right.
This isn't the right. I apologize. I'm sharing one that was on my screen. It is not correct. It's on here.
This one?
No, it's under housing. So it's on this under housing, and then it's the it's the last time do the 1528.
The one?
1528.
Oh, you didn't save it as a PDF?
I did, but that's not it either. Oh, Jay, do this one 529.
Sorry, we put up, we updated all of this with the public comments. Which one?
What is this one?
There it is.
Okay, yay. I apologize for that. Okay, so I want to have a discussion about the 200% AMI. And what I want to start with is that the pros and cons that I have on your screen right now, or that are in your document.
Well, this is updated.
Yeah, I updated this too.
Okay.
So the pros for the 200% AMI, and these are not things that I'm saying, these are things that we got from the feedback, which I sent to everybody, in addition to things that we have heard, and again, the two overwhelming things that we've heard from the elected officials have been that we want to take care of Lake County-based workers over commuters. So the 200% AMI prioritizes all levels of Lake County-based employee residents, regardless of salary. It allows employees with seniority to find home ownership. And we have from one of the charrettes, Michael was talking to a social worker, and he was afraid to take a raise because he wouldn't qualify for housing if he took his raise. And we've heard from employers, for example, Fritz, that he wanted to keep the AMIs high so that his employees would qualify. If the AMIs are lower, where does the additional money come to subsidize the project? And average income, and there's the example about the teachers. If a married couple making $57,000, they would just come in under that $200,000 AMI. Affordability, home prices for 200% AMI worker is at now with interest rates climbing at $425,000. And you'll see also in your packet of papers, the Lake County median home price for April jumped from $607,000 for March to $757,000 for April. So the cons that we're hearing, 200% AMI is too high and doesn't serve the lower income people. Housing subsidies should not be awarded to families with decent paying jobs. Lake County should prioritize marginalized community members with housing efforts. And workers over 120% AMI should find housing in the free market. Families making $150,000 a year should not have a problem finding housing in Leadville. And of course, we're looking at this, and it's because of our values. It's becoming more and more challenging. And we shouldn't be building housing for upper income earners. Prioritizes single wage earners over families, and allows for remote workers in tier 4 at 200% AMI. So somebody who is working from home and they're based out of elsewhere.
Yeah, that last comment came in the form of, which I think is a legitimate comment. Trying to interpret what they were saying, but they were concerned that somebody working in Denver under 200% AMI could buy a house here if they lived in Lake County. So that tier 4 has that 200% AMI. So you're prioritizing that over like the tier 5.
So
Please speak this way.
yeah, sorry. Okay. So this is like Jackie said. I mean, we're at a point where this is the final piece of the guideline, which is great. I mean, you guys got here in 2 meetings over 6 months. It took me and Crescent with the council in the same exact guidelines. So yay that we're talking about this last tiered system. Again, there's pros and cons are from the public comment. So that's why we wanted to present that to the council and the BOCC today. And this, there's no pride or authorship between Jackie and I on these. It's really your community guidelines. So we want to hear, and then from this discussion today, we plan to take the draft guidelines to the city council first, and then hopefully any changes and recommendations to BOCC and have these adopted so they can be used.
I understand that that people may think that the 200% AMI is going too far. I would disagree for the reasons that were pointed out, because we do have, we have firemen and we have hospital workers. They're by far the highest paid people in the universe. Of course. But I'm, in all seriousness, we do have people who are paid well, but still we can't get them to move here because they can't buy. And the second thing I would say, let's say for the sake of argument, we build, like these guidelines are one thing. You build 100 houses. You might say, okay, half of these will be 200% AMI. And, you know, and the rest of them will be at a lower AMI. And these guidelines wouldn't necessarily cover that, but it's just something that you could do to maybe balance that situation.
On that note, I don't see why if we can flex these guidelines to that extent where we can cover that 120 to 200% AMI, we don't stick with the one that at a basis covers our most marginalized community. Because I fully agree that these are people in our community who should be able to buy a house and deserve to buy a house, quite frankly. But I don't think that when we speak about purely at the baseline about affordable housing, we should be necessarily targeting that wide of a range. I do think that we should definitely work very intentionally to make sure that that is a covered section when we do flex for that and we make adjustments to some of these guidelines for certain projects. I don't think that should be true at a baseline though. I think we should really look at this as a baseline, and I think that we should take in mind our most marginalized community. I mean, for example, I only make around 40,000 a year. To me, compete with someone who's making that much more feels unfair to me, right? I understand why I am because of how insane our market is. Sorry for lack of words, but like our market's just crazy and it's unmanageable. But that seems like a problem that we should also tackle on top of the affordable housing issue and even wages themselves. Because I feel like 200 AMI sitting at, what is it, 103,000 for one person doesn't seem quite right now, given how expensive it is to live in Lake County nowadays. So maybe we should address also the wage issues to where that number maybe reflects a little bit better and bring up those lower end workers to a higher standard so that they can continue to live through in Lake County. Because if we think about it, I mean, if we look at these numbers, 50% AMI is $25,000 for an individual. I wasn't making that. I was making that not too long ago when I worked at Subway, you know? And quite frankly, like it would be unlivable right now for me to be making that, even living with my parents and basically getting extremely lenient rent and cost coverage from them, even at that low end number, just because of how insanely expensive even gas is nowadays, right? So I think we should really purposely look at this to target the marginalized community, but also to really assure the community that we will get to those higher, or I wouldn't say higher because in reality, they're not higher compared to the market right now, but the other community members who are making a little bit more than what they are in the 120 to 200% range. And we should definitely build houses for them that are specifically tailored for them. There may be more family units and specifically made to be for those people and not necessarily in that, you know, 80 to 120% range.
So how would you amend this?
So I would amend it just to, I mean, it's at a baseline, I would say it's 120 to 200, or no, sorry, wrong. 80 to 120% AMI in that tier 2 section.
Okay.
And then in any projects that we want to directly focus on these higher end essential workers that we do have, 120 to 200 be the guideline, right? That way we're not worried about, and I think one of the arguments here were how are we going to get the money, or you know, who's going to subsidize that housing essentially. It would make sense to have that 120 to 200 general cap, right? So that we can afford that general payment. And I'm not sure what that looks like, but that makes sense to me.
Sure.
Sorry. So I'm hearing kind of two philosophies. One is making our definition in these tiers wider, like up to 200. And then within that spectrum, targeting certain projects would target certain parts of that spectrum. And then Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard you say is lower that spectrum and then target projects outside of it. And I don't really get what the difference is. They seem like sort of the same.
So I explained it like this. This is what that 200% or 120% AMI number is really important to is somebody who is desperate trying to find a house to purchase. and is in a situation where they need to know, do I and my family qualify for a housing project in the future? And if you say with these guidelines, the elected officials are making a statement to, at this AMI level, you will not qualify for a housing. So you should be actively looking in the free market. And I think that is my advice to you, because what what you set your cap at as a policy is going to be very hard moving forward for a developer to come in and say, I want to build. If your cap is 120, then you're telling the building community and development community, that's our number. That's who qualifies for a deed restricted house. So that's what's really important, and with that number as it relates. Though there is, in reading the comments, there was one thing I picked up on is that tier 4. That tier 4 is one that is, that tier with the 200% AMI allows for folks who work outside of this valley who are telecommuters. There was a couple writing comments on that. That is a legitimate right, because you're prioritizing potentially a telecommuter over, they technically would fall under tier 5, right? But I wouldn't get hung up on 200. You can look at these AMIs and you could adjust it down if wherever you feel as a policymakers, you could drop it down to 160, for instance. I mean, that's my point. The only other thing is, and I always bring this up because this is why when I get on my high horse on AMIs, when I hate that, is and as a single guy, this is like one of the few times I ever could say this, but this prioritizes single people. It's the only, I mean, so if you were married and you both made $40,000, you would not be under 120% as a family. So that's the other big piece of the puzzle, is it doesn't double for families, and that's something to take into consideration.
I'd like to get back to Christian's thought process in that I wasn't sure I agree with it, but I kind of get it. And that is setting the baseline is like a mental baseline almost. Here's what we're really, these are the first people we want to take care of. Now, like I said, in any housing development, especially depending on the funding, they're going to have some of them at that lower end anyway. And they're going to have some at the higher end, and some may even have to be completely market rate in order for it to pencil out. So I don't think it's as big a problem, but I think he may be right that first tier, or the second tier, might need to be 80 to 120, just as a baseline thought.
Well, and you don't need to do 80 to 120. I would just do 120 and below, right? Because someone that's in 60.
And I think Tracy would agree with you. She's not able to attend, and she did text me and said that she was hoping that she stated tier 2 and tier 3 being switched, but I think it was mostly about the 120% of AMI or less. So I just wanted to get that out there, that's what she was saying. Cool.
I think right now we have a crisis. The crisis is being able to provide housing for folks that need to work here and want to work here. Evidence of that crisis is we just spent we're going to spend $800,000 on a house. So this is a crisis that needs to be prioritized. We're not prioritizing for what's good. And who are we representing? Right. You need to cover Leadville and Lake County before anything else. That needs to be prioritized. And I also think by prioritizing that, we can work to solve the all-encompassing problem. I think it's achievable to solve the local workforce problem. We prioritize it, and focus on it, and narrow our goal to do that. Whatever the AMI needs to be able to solve that problem is where it needs to be. I like it higher. I like it at the 200. I think that's appropriate. I think that serves a lot of the people that we need here to serve our community.
I would agree with I would agree with up to the 200 mark, because even at that 200 mark, that's still a really tight budget, you know, for someone to be living on. As we get down into the 80 mark, my question would be, you know, where these homes we're talking about are still around that 200,000 mark, you're talking a $1,200 to $1,500 payment. For someone that's making, you know, $300 to $3,500 a month, to get them into a $1,200 or $1,500 payment, is that really the right thing, or does that make them, you know, mortgage poor, house rich, even though we're getting them into a housing piece, you know? So I mean, there'd also be individual decision making, even if we do lower that, you know. So I mean, I think it just needs to be a family decision, and as we have the classes to get them ready to move into all of this with those processes, I think that will help to play. So I agree with Christian. I'm very happy to support lowering that, but I think we also do need to keep it up at that 200 mark, because, you know, in recruiting, this is my worst nightmare. You know, I can recruit all day long, get folks to want to come join our community up here, but they can't afford housing. So, you know, my newer folks are now looking down in BV. You know, my nurse practitioner that's coming up this weekend, you know, they're looking down in BV, so they'll commute up. You know, and that nurse practitioner, okay, even though, yeah, we are the most highly paid in the universe, you know, she's in that 120 to 130 range, you know, which puts them above the 200. So, you know, it exclude her, you know, but still that's not a luxurious budget, you know, for a family to be living off of. So I think as we look at, we're trying to focus in definitely on our workforce folks, our folks that have lived here. You know, I think we're kind of hitting that right range, you know, but recognizing, you know, that there's still going to be challenges, you know, even above that 200 mark.
I haven't thought about that, but if you start with a lower AMI, maybe 120, the problem almost solves itself. In the sense that in that range, fewer people will be able to make that mortgage. Not make it financially, to have a tough time qualifying. And so it's I don't know, just a thought.
It's almost self-selective.
Yeah.
You know, give them the chance, you know, maybe they've been stellar and they've been able to save, you know, like an incredible person. And, you know, maybe they can qualify for that. And that's what I like about dropping that, because, you know, if someone has been really responsible and we can get them into that, I think that is one of the best successes we could ask for with this program.
So why don't we explore the idea of then adding another, and I know this is way more tiers and all that fun stuff, but another tier system then, so that people like myself who feel like they're an essential person in the community, you know, I help people all the time get connected to rent assistance through ERAP, and I make sure our families don't get evicted. I mean, Full Circle itself has helped well over 300 people at this point with utility assistance, rental assistance, all this stuff to make sure that these people are able to continue living in our community and providing to our community, even if they don't have the opportunity or don't feel like working here or whatever the case, for whatever reason they don't work here, where it's a lot of cases they do end up working here, but still can't reach those raises. It doesn't feel fair to me to compete with someone who's making that much more, even though I feel like I would be a qualified candidate for this essential worker who's home buyer ready. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that I feel like it's unfair to pit me against people who will be even more home buyer ready than me for a house, even though this is affordable housing. To me, that kind of tells me as a community member that this is supposed to be built for me, right? And again, I want to say that these ranges speak to a bigger issue in my mind. The fact that 50% is 25,000, like, I don't know who could live off of that. And I know there are people making that. We've helped a few people now who make even 0%, right, at Full Circle. So I think that there is a bigger issue here that we need to handle. And eventually, fingers crossed, these numbers reflect what they actually should be. If we look at other communities, these 120% figures are relatively high for their standards of living in terms of, you know, affordable housing in comparison to what we're looking at. So I understand that right now our numbers at 200% are looking like they'd be the most homebuyer readies. But I guess that's kind of the point of affordable housing, is to get these people who previously are poor and working class into this middle class and bring them up and really push them to be ready and part of our community the same way that we claim our middle class is, right? And they are most of the time, right? So I again want to urge us to think of us at large scope, because I do think that we will, and I promise you that I will in city council work our hardest to reach this 200% market and work to flex this model at some other projects. But at a baseline, I think we should be telling our community, we're here for all of you. And I don't think that 200% speaks for all of us. I don't think that that 200% is fair to those people who are at the 120% even, who feel like, you know, oh, I'm only making 61 comparatively to 103, right? I agree that the numbers are also skewed because families are way more difficult to handle, and AMI doesn't seem to really adjust for that properly. But it just feels so unfair to me to tell those families of 120% that the 200% people have as fair of a shot as they do for a housing, even though they're part of the community. This it's equally, right? And again, I want to preface this by saying I think we can definitely target this, 120 to 200% range. I don't think there's an issue with targeting that at other projects.
I think your point is very well taken. And just for point of clarification, if you move to the 200%, it covers everything below that, correct?
Yeah.
So those between 80 and 120 would still not be left out, but I understand your point of feeling pitted against someone that makes the 200% right. But to your larger point of this really bringing the conversation full circle of trying to tackle the wage issue, we will inadvertently shoot ourselves in the foot by going only 180 to 120. Because like Jackie and Michael had said, we'll have workers like a social worker, which is what we experience right now in real time, saying, I don't want to have a raise because I don't want to not be able to afford to be put in a strong or affordable housing. But we want social workers, and we want to be able to address the wage problem, and we want qualified people to work in those roles. And I think if we go from 80 to 120 only, we're going to limit ourselves.
I have a proposal that might be a compromise. I feel like within this group, we're trying to serve two demographics. People who work here and may have lived here a long time or maybe not. People who, and some of those people might be coming to work here. The other demographic is folks who've lived here a long time, and we want to support them gaining access to housing at lower income levels. So because this is a lottery, right? This is a lottery. Like this just gets your name in the hat, and then you draw a name. I propose we combine tier 2 and 3 into tier 2, because then there's two ways you could get your name in that tier 2 lottery. You could have lived here a long time, 4 years or more, making the lower rate, or you could be an employee and the lottery would be the luck of the draw.
I think that would kind of answer it, because then it helps provide a little bit more priority, a little more chance on that end. I'm still not comfortable thinking that someone at 200% is actively competing with someone at 80 or 120 or 100 or better than that. But I think that might help ease up and give a little more option, to fill in some of those other folks and get that lower AMI in tier 2 before we move on to tier 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just comment on that? When you start commingling like local workforce with commuters in a tier, you're not solving any problems. You can build affordable housing as much of it as you want. And if you are prioritizing out of county workforce, you'll never, ever, ever solve that problem. And it's not our problem to solve. we have a crisis we need to address. We need to prioritize our local workforce. And if we lower that AMI to 120%, we're excluding a lot of critical workforce that we need folks to live here and work here. And we need housing to be available.
So you're saying it should be lower than the
I think
120?
it should be higher. I think we need to
I,
keep it
I agree at keeping it at 200.
200%.
I just think we should make a route for the 120 and below, because what is it, 80% of our county commutes?
75.
75.
Yeah, but that's not a
So
good thing.
for those of us who are elected officials, 75% of the people we represent are having to commute. And I feel like we need to represent those folks as well as the
They're being
25%.
represented in tier 3. They're not being prioritized, but they're being represented. And although the rents might be high in Leadville, they're a lot cheaper than they are in Eagle and Summit.
So
So those folks that work out of county, we already offer them an affordable option to the places where they work.
Can I, Ben, just coming back to Cisco's idea of trying to figure out a way to address your concern, Christian, of like giving the 120 and under people like a little bit more of a first shot, or like, you know, not being, as you said, like competing with people who earn twice what they do. And Tim, I agree with you. I think, I mean, at least in my mind, sort of made the decision to prioritize Lake County-based employees a little bit first. And so Cisco, I think your idea kind of, it does sort of cross that line for me. But I think that in tier 2, I think so. I would like to see a way to give the 120% AMI and under in tier 2. Maybe they work here.
I'm sorry, maybe a tier in between.
Yeah.
Well, and then
Is that-
my only other comment,
And then you go to local workforce 120 and up, and then you widen it out to all of our, positions.
and just for, if we were to eliminate this tier.
Yeah.
And then do a 120, a 200, tier 3 is the 120 that actually prioritizes that commuter that is in the service industry first. These 200%ers that are potentially telecommuters don't get any priority over a retiree that's been in the community. Does that make sense?
It does.
And then you still only have, you said the same amount of tiers, you just have, you eliminated this tier and created a 120 tier.
So I did want to address one thing, and then, sorry, Sarah, I know I'm talking a lot. I get the idea that we need to bring people in. I really do. We just don't have the right qualified people in our community, unfortunately, right now to hire locally. I get that. And I get that it's just not possible right now. However, this tier 2 right now does not address who we currently, right now, are representing. These are future workers, and I know they're very important. Like, you know, to your point, Brett, like, these are people who are going to provide essential services to us, right? These are your workers, even, that you're recruiting here. But me as an elected official, I'm representing the people right now who live here, who've lived here their whole lives. My parents, for example, right? These are people that have given to their community time and time again. Even if it's not this direct same way, my dad has worked his ass off doing side jobs for cheap money because he knows people need that in plumbing, right? And he's not getting accommodated by this. He's lucky enough to own a house already because he bought it before any of this crap happened. But there's plenty of people who aren't been in our community who don't have that opportunity and who haven't, who want to have families here, who want to have kids here, who want to have generational wealth created for them here. And they're just as essential as many other people that we are currently talking about in our community. And they provide to the community as much as those people are right now. And they will continue to provide for our community because they've lived here, they've grown up here. Their kids, I am one of their kids, they've grown up here. So I urge you guys to really think about those families as much as we think as these essential workers who are essential, who do provide these essential things for us. I love the idea that Cisco said of combining tier 2 and 3, and I'd be happy with that. That sounds like a good compromise to me, even if I still have my gripes about it being me competing with the 200%. Fine, I'll deal with it. You know, it's a lottery system, you know? Ultimately, it's a lottery system. It'll be luck of the draw, right? And I think they're as important as I am. And I think tier 2 and 3 being combined, at least I can speak to my community and the people that I came here to represent, that we are doing something for them and not just the people making a lot who are going to be imported from other communities. We're addressing the people who've been working here, who've been putting their effort and time into here, who have their kids going to these schools right now, growing up. I mean, 70% of our kids in school are Latinos. That's not reflected in that 200% at all.
So I can't agree to commingling out of county workforce, local workforce, not solving any problems in there. What I would be agreeable to is to make that tier 2 your 120 or less, Lake County based employee. And then a tier 3 at 200 Lake County based employee at 200.
I agree with
120
that.
to 200.
That's what I'd like to see. All you're doing is adding a tier. You're not reinventing the wheel. Another thing I'd like to say is, and this might sound, it's not what we're considering here, but it's something Sarah and I have been to meetings years ago that talked about other counties helping us with our housing. What if somebody who lives out of county has to bring a subsidy from that county in order to qualify for that tier? So I'm sorry. That's, I know I'm throwing a wrench in the works. It's just a thought.
Yeah.
But we've asked them to join us in the housing problem because it's their housing problem too. And they kind of refuse.
It's tier 1.
But how?
Because if say Summit County commissioners came in and said, we're going to give you $2 million for the Climax parcel to assist in getting that developed, then you would adjust your tiers to accommodate potential Summit County employees. Well, you would write a lottery system for this. And to your 120, just as an example, the last project I did was 25 units. We added $40,000 or $50,000 to the 200% AMI units, and we discounted the 120% AMI units. But they all, and under this tier, they all apply for the same lottery. And if a 120 got picked, they could choose a 120,000 or 120% AMI unit. If a 200% person got picked, they were not allowed to choose a 120 unit. So if they were over the value, but they still were all in the same lottery. And that's how we did, because there's, and the nexus for that is that there is a direct subsidy for the folks, because that's the affordability for that person. A 120 can't afford a 200%. So, I mean, you're going to adjust, to your point, all of these lotteries, you're going to wind up adjusting. But I think the bigger, and you're 100% right, it's more about the message, right? And if you, whatever that is, I'm not hearing anybody saying that we don't want, like 200% is too much. It's just, where does it rank? And I think that's an important thing that's coming out of this conversation is that if you look at this and you're a nurse practitioner, you're like, well, if I'm looking for housing, the affordable housing program could be a potential option, I think. And that's,
But they would also be in a lower tier because they're not residents. So that would help kind of address Cisco's point as well. The folks that have been here, the legacy families, they get priority.
yep.
Also would like to remind us that the tiers are there because it spills from tier to tier.
Right.
And in an ideal world, you might fill all those tiers with a certain development. Because of demand.
Well, I'll just tell you, the reality of development is you could have a 25 unit development that you're ready to go. And if you don't have 25 people under contract, you're only building 18 if they're under contract. So you don't want a tiered system that excludes your ability to get the house built.
Yeah.
So, and normally they want to see it like a 50% contingency of people in the back, in the wings.
Brett, I'd like to ask you, because I think you touched on this a bit. Do you think that having that 200% at a lower tier would discourage some of your employees from potentially seeing this as an option from legacy Lake County residents?
I don't think it would be discouraging. If anything, having the 200% of the lower tier, I think would be beneficial.
Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of husband-wife teams, you know, that work for me. I think I've got 6 or 7 of them. So as I think about them, you know, they're not necessarily even hitting that 200 mark. You know, I have a couple that works in my UBS department, you know, and they've lived here for years and years and years. You know, they're part of, you know, not the Latino community, but the Polish community.
Yeah.
You know, that's here in town, which isn't as large as our Latino population, but it's still substantial. You know, I think about, you know, their dreams and how they would fit into this. And, you know, even by having that 200 at a lower level, it's still a lottery. And what I like about what's being said is, you know, even though they might be hitting at that, say, 150 AMI, they would be subsidized to get a unit that would fit their qualifications and their financial needs. And, you know, say someone is at the 200 mark, they get, you know, they're spending more money in that and they're not subsidized as much as one of my, you know, other folks that maybe are making as much. So I'm really loving how this is evolving and being set up. And I don't see it as a disadvantage at all. I'm sorry, I referred to you as Cisco, even though it's totally cool. That's probably really a compliment.
Yeah.
Whoa. So we have a huge, the next section of this agenda is really huge. The only question I have to trying to get this to draft format to be considered is, so it sounds like we want to add that tier between basically tier 2 as a 120 to tier 3 as a 200, both Lake County based. Tier 3. My last question is there any appetite to nixing tier 4? That was a comment those are comments that have been made. We have the tier 4 just becomes all your tier 5. So if you're basically what it does is it gives tier, it gives that 120 tier of commuters an edge up, and then if you're not under 120, you just fall to tier 5.
Yeah.
So where's that? And
So can I just ask a clarifying question? Just in passing, you mentioned like it seemed like you had run a system where tier 2 isn't split. It's just you can't sort of bid down, if you will. Like you can't so if you're in tier 2 at 200, you can't opt into a 120. So which to me sort of accomplishes the same goal of splitting tier 2.
it does.
I'm not advocating for it, I'm trying to understand.
What it comes down to is that each project is going to be unique. Now, I have done projects where the only price point was 120. So we did a project that I had 6 units that were all based at 120. And so anybody that was over 120, when we did the lottery, tier 2 in this model tier 2 in the model we're talking about got first priority. Any leftover units went to tier 3 and then to tier 4.
But either way, either of those two systems, people in the 120 tier are getting a shot
First.
120
Yeah.
Before 200%.
I'm wondering, and I'm not. What is the risk if we have the 120? I am in agreement with Tim. I mean, I'm in agreement with a lot of it, but also not just representing, but serving the community. And a lot of those higher paying jobs are with local government districts serving the community. And I'm not debating the value of all local jobs or workers. But I think it should be 200 and local workers. But just if we put the 120 first, are we making a veiled promise that we can subsidize a project to meet all of those that submit to be?
No, I don't think you are. And the reason there's one, at the end of the day, when you actually get to the point of building a project out, you do a pro forma and you try again. What this tells me is like, I'm obviously been sitting in these conversations, but if I was your developer for affordable housing project and you put out an RFQ for like we're doing with the design charrette, and you said, we have 60 units worth of land, give me a pro forma on this. I'm gonna use your tier system and I'm gonna look at it and say, okay, I'm gonna try to shoot for X number of 120 units, then I can also price a couple 200% AMI units, and kind of, that's what me as a developer are gonna look at in this tiered system and saying, okay, here's where I'm trying to get my unit counts, and this is where the community prioritizes. Ultimately, the other big piece of the puzzle I'm not even talking about is that anytime you take state funding or a external funding source, they are going to put their own AMI on the side.
And those prioritize well over, I would say.
Yes, well,
They fully prioritize.
yeah, there's no such thing as free money.
Is it accurate to assume that 200% AMI, the higher the AMI goes, the smaller the pool of people? The likelihood is that the pool of people gets smaller that would apply for that in our community.
No,
Because
No.
they're still in that lower tiers, right?
you guys are at, it's an
Well,
economic,
no,
it's in, your question is an actual economic, it's not has anything to do with this. The economics are that even at 200%, I have to build something under 450. At 450, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, brand new house at 450 in this community is discounted $250,000. So you're gonna have people lined up around the corner to get in, regardless of
but
their.
so to that point though, then what, I don't understand how we can subsidize. I mean, I just don't understand how we can.
It's up to, like each project, again, this is where this document is at the 100,000 foot level. I know there's some of you that are going down into like the 10-foot level, like what's our next project gonna look like? You gotta keep it up here because the performas, every project's gonna be different based on your subsidy and your gap financing that comes in. So if it's just purely like a subsidy based on like the loan or the land has been donated is one thing, or if we're successful with the Dollar grant, they're gonna say all those houses that are built with any of the money from the Dollar grant are 140 or less, period. No exceptions. And it's like, do we want the $1 million? And so they don't care about this. Being very frank.
So is there a middle scenario where, say, for the middle tier, say you get everyone draws the lottery for those homes, everyone's that high money, but there's not enough 120 units. You know, is there an example where, you know, you have 1,520 units, we could draw in the lottery for 18 people? And they're all the 120 mark, but we can't subsidize those other 3 at the 120.
Yeah.
Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, you run into that.
Okay.
Yep. And then yeah.
And those folks wind up with priority for the next project, and you move to your 140s.
And I'll be honest with you, after you do a lot, you do a lottery into every name is drawn out of the lottery. Because the bank, that the construction lender, wants every single person to be in line. And I can tell you, in every single project, I have almost always gone into the waiting list at least 3 or 4 deep.
True, because you'd always have maybe some folks that fall out or move in.
Well, yeah. And then,
Whatever the scenario. Okay.
And it's my understanding you have to be home buyer ready, right?
oh yeah.
And that might be difficult for a lot of our community who does live in that 120% anyway. So I imagine that at least when we're starting, and you know, hopefully this isn't too big of an issue, but at least when we're starting, I imagine it's going to be an issue where we might find a bit of trouble finding anyone below the 120% anyways to be a home buyer ready in that quick span of time. My understanding is that hopefully we'll have the Chivy housing trusts buildings up by 2023. Is that right, Mayor? So
That's on our wish list.
yeah.
I just
Fingers
fear that under
crossed.
the 200 really excludes families.
And I'm not saying remove it. I'm just saying we should prioritize different things. And I think they'll get a fair shot, honestly, given how quick these units are going up and how hard it will be, especially going forward for this 120% and lower to be home buyer ready by 2023.
Yeah, when you do a lottery, the day after their name is picked, they have to come up with a $5,000 escrow check.
And that's,
And if they don't have the $5,000 escrow check, it's the next step.
I wouldn't have $5,000 right now for that.
I mean, and that's not even, that's like a 3% or 1.5% down.
Yeah.
That's not even a 3% normally required to get.
So I really don't think that we would be excluding those people, not by including them in the lower tier than our 120% makers. I think that they will get a fair shot at housing. And I think this speaks to the message that we as elected officials care about our marginalized community who do offer these services that maybe go unlooked at a lot of the time. And I know at least I get talked to a lot by my community, especially Latina community, who isn't in that 200% range at all, like not remotely close. They're sitting in the 120% range if they're lucky.
So, because we do, it's 7 o'clock and we have, I want to get past this last thing. The only question I still have as far as a drafter is, so it sounds like we want to put the initial draft and you guys again will have another shot at this. But to add a tier in between 2 and 3. My last question though is, do you want to eliminate tier 4 as it is today? Or
I'd be happy.
That doesn't bother me.
anybody else? Okay.
I would remove it.
Any other comments on that? Okay, all right. So it keeps, what? Yep.
I just want to give you guys a number to think about, like instead of stopping at 120. So out of my 149 FTE, 98 of them fall between 80 and 140%. So if you could go up a little higher, that would be,
Saying 140.
yes. If you're not going to go up to 200. Of my 140, 65% are been 80 to 140 AMI.
So that
I mean,
would,
that sounds sensible to me. I think having the 140 figure.
Tier 2 is 140 less, and then tier 3 is 141 to 200. That makes
Or
sense.
200 and less.
I think that's a fair
200
compromise.
less. Yeah.
And is that first tier then Lake County, employees working in Lake County making
Both-
140 and
both
less?
2 and 3 would be Lake County based employees. Tier 4 now become, or
Yeah,
tier 4 becomes any commuter making, do we want to bump that to 140 or is that still 120?
It
And
makes
that's-
sense if it's 140.
Okay, 140, and if they've been here for 4 years and they're a commuter, and they get, and then.
And the rest are.
Sure, yeah, and the 200% are captured under
Tier 5.
and you still have 5 tiers. Your life isn't so bad.
I liked it when we had 2 tiers. I'm just saying, from an administration point, that was.
All right,
There's gonna be a lot more tiers than that.
all right. So, thank you. So that
Tiers.
gets us to the point of having a draft come before the city council. Lori will be reaching out to get on your agendas shortly with community guidelines.
You want to be on the next agenda?
Heck yeah, let's keep it moving.
Another.
Or the next time you have an available slot.
And we can send,
Oh, even midnight.
Well, anyhow, we'll talk, but I do want to keep this moving because this next topic is actually going to be, this regional housing authority is actually, I expect to be a robust discussion because this actually has, not that the community guidelines are important, but this has a lot to it. Again, as envisioned in the community guidelines, there's basically a regional housing authority model that is looked at to control the guidelines and administer the guidelines. Under statute, a regional housing authority has a bit more powers than just the current housing authority that's one jurisdictional. And again, after talking with the professionals on the Zoom call, which was great that Jackie set up with Jennifer Demode and Lori from Summit County, I think the difference between the two was really pointed out in in the taxing authority and the other powers that are granted through statute through regional housing authority. Excellent. So we did get great feedback on board makeup. 2 from the city, 2 appointed by the city, 2 appointed by the county, 1 each being elected, and 3 at large. So I think this gives us the initial board makeup. And I want to go next slide. We talked about the different things that we wanted to see that this regional housing authority would take on. Sorry, mine's really small. Administration of housing programs, development of housing projects, which we'll talk about ad nauseum here in a little bit. Management of potential management of properties, which is a revenue stream. And authority to administer housing guidelines. We talked about that. Write, receive, and leverage grants. Obviously, we wanted them to do that. Land banking is actually really important, especially for the city, because you're statutory. So if you are in receivership of like the Laurel parcel, being able to have an entity that can take that land and not have to do the vote thing as required under statute. So whenever you require or are able to get land, we have a land banking agency now, and then set policies for housing solutions long run, which is a huge piece of the board, because the goal is to help you not go to midnight meetings anymore. Is that this board would talk about housing at their board meetings, and you could deal with city council and stuff at city council meetings and get an update, like a 2-minute update from your board member, instead of spending hours talking about housing stuff. So that's a really important thing. More meetings, right? These are the programs we talked about. Again, I don't need to go through the list because we're kind of running short on time, but these are all things. But this is where I want, so there's two really important things tonight that we need feedback on, Jackie and I, so that we can work with the attorneys to draft bylaws to get in front of the two boards. First and foremost is taxing authority. So taxing authority, we've had some initial discussions. I think we'll dig with the attorneys, dig really deep into making sure this is correct, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and not issue a legal opinion, but give basically the feedback we've heard from the other regional housing authorities. The regional housing authority has the ability to put this on the ballot. So it doesn't require them to come back to the city council or the BOCC. They can directly put a ballot initiative, if given the power through the bylaws to do this. They have the ability to do a 1% sales tax, up to $5 million property tax, or levy a impact fee of, what is it, $2 a square foot. So this is a huge decision. It is, if you look at the dollar amounts, what this would equate to for housing in the community, it's huge. It also represents, I'm sure as elected officials, if you've ever put a ballot initiative forward, you understand the complexities that it's not, like for instance, a property tax is the easy one. There's a lot of other jurisdictions that rely on property taxes for their operation. So increasing, for instance, giving the ability to increase property tax could potentially take another jurisdiction's ability at a later ballot year, because property taxes get to a certain point where they don't have that capacity. Same thing with sales tax. Same thing with sales tax, right? So you can, in the bylaws, prohibit the housing authority from doing one of these three things. So you could say, for instance, the housing authority may only get revenue through a sales tax, or may only get revenue through a property tax. And you could even say you may only get property taxes up to 2 mils. And you could limit the 5 mil threshold, or the sales tax. You could say they can go up to a 0.5%. But once that decision's made and the guidelines are there, keep in mind that just for clarity, that goes to a vote, right? And the board also has they can put that to a vote at any point. And they could do 1 mil 1 year and another mil 10 years from now. Or they could do a 0.5% now and a 0.5% 10 years from now. So it's not like, and again, your electorate votes on this. There's no way around that. But this is really important. And whether or not, I mean, right now, functionally, with the contributions you're getting from the town and the city to pay for this position, it covers administrative costs. And the good news is, even as a regional housing authority, what you have contributed is going to make a lasting impact through the programming. And programming comes along with other dollars that will allow additional staff to be brought on through fees and stuff that is administered. So at a minimum, not having this still creates a functional regional housing authority. I want to be clear there. It just doesn't, the development, we all know what a house costs. So without meaningful revenue, it's going to be very hard to really make dents in construction. The only other big piece of the puzzle when you think about this, because even $2 million isn't a lot of houses in this market. a lot of regional housing authorities leverage that 10 times. So that money goes, when you have a revenue source like that, you're able to go to a state funder, you're able to participate with a developer in a larger project to attract funds. You're able to put in a sewer main or a water main infrastructure to pay for make land available to a developer to build houses. So that, don't lose track on, I know that those numbers, even like at the high levels, are kind of wouldn't be like a massive impact. That actually is, a lasting impact. My short-term rental tax in Crested Butte the first year collected $325, and I went from building 6 units a year to 20 units a year with just $325,000. And that was because I was able to leverage that money 10 times over.
How does the 2A money factor in? Like, is that the money we're getting from our lodging tax? Would it be going to this authority, or would it be going to the city and then the city
Right
decides?
now, it goes into just a housing fund, that's it. The
Managed
decision
by
of
the
how it
city.
gets used has actually not been made.
And we can make that decision
Sure.
as we see, right? So if we want to allocate a certain percentage of that period to this fund, we could.
Well, keep it in mind, there's a total, and we think that total is $215,000. We don't know if that's right, or not, but it's a projection. So 70,000 of that goes towards the housing grant. And but only 35 comes out of that fund. So I don't want to get into too much complication. 83,000 of it is projected to go to the tourism academy. And then we had, I think there's another cost in there. So what we ended up with was around $60,000 that was usable over and above the cost of that $215,000. It's not a big number. It was never intended to solve a lot of problems, but it was a start. Yeah.
And that kind of funding will pay for the administrative functions of a regional housing, which is great. That's a huge, that's an employee, that's programming that you did not have in this community prior to it.
Seems to me foolish not to give it some funding mechanism power. But if it comes up to like the school district wants to raise wages and they need to pass a new mill levy, but they're in competition with housing, that seems like the most likely conflict I would see.
Well, we can limit how many mills they can use, right? Which would address that issue, I think, to some extent. Obviously, I think there'll still be some inherent competition because it comes from property tax. But also my understanding is that we could use sales as well, right?
Yeah.
So.
And who else, just because I'm the F and G in this room, who else who relies on property taxes besides the school district? Is the hospital district get property tax?
Yeah.
Who else? CMC?
Not sanitation, not-
No, sanitation gets some more.
Oh, they do sanitation. does them.
So you can see the property tax.
Metro districts.
They pay property tax or they get?
They have a mill levy that's assessed on
Oh.
property owners, yes. They have to pay property.
Here's the problems I see. So it's the 800,000 bonus. How do you get this to pass? People in the city, we're hearing it all the time, a lot of them, their taxes have doubled in the last 3 years. The property taxes literally doubled. That's because of assessed value. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And then if we go to them and ask for additional tax, it's just going to be a tough step. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. We need to do this. We need to do this, but
But
how we fund it could be tricky.
And it is the reality. We talked about it earlier that like Eagle County, they got shot down. They tried to do it and the voters were like, no way.
Madison County, our regional housing authority got our butt kicked in.
Mhm.
So the question I have on this is, so if you do a property tax, your residents or anybody who owns the property, that's the person who bears that tax. Sales tax includes people who shop here, which is tourists and residents. And so I think if you're looking at what could pass, what I've seen in communities is where you have a tax that is to some extent borne by the people who come and visit. That they're paying part of that tax as well. They carry part of that and they're actually contributing towards something beneficial to the community. Those are more likely to past, but I think with this, you can give the authority to the housing authority and they can decide not to exercise it. And I think it would be incredibly smart to make sure you did the research to make sure whatever you were proposing had a chance to pass it. And
And
there's plenty.
communicate with the other taxing entities to see if their plan is something.
Can you do
Yeah,
all
there
three?
are independent consultants
No, you-
that municipalities hire all the time to run, basically, information campaign to see, check the temperature on what is likely to pass. And I think if you're gonna put the time and effort towards whatever it is you decide, it is worth it to get a consultant to find out if that it has a chance of passing.
And-
Coloradans don't like to tax themselves, they just don't. But a sales tax is not just borne by the residents.
And, well, and I understand what you're saying with the due diligence piece. I will be out of consultant dollars by the time the due diligence, so you're not mentioning, you're just talking about before the board, if they were given taxing authority, do the due diligence, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify, you're not talking about, right?
You can make the decision to give them the authority,
Yeah.
and they can choose to never exercise it.
Yes,
But if you don't give them the authority, they can never exercise it.
gotcha. Just making sure I understood
You
you.
could put that developer impact fee in place 10 years ago. I know it's too late. So far.
Well, and other things to consider, right, like, so like with the mills, right, competition with other taxing entities, but like also, so future things that the city or county would want to do, like joining a regional transit authority, things like that, there are other, this is competing with other future revenue streams. I know this is the crisis to address today, but that's also just something to keep in the back of your minds when you think about this decision.
And prohibiting the ability to levy a property tax doesn't prohibit the ability for the conversation to increase contribution of their own property tax.
True.
Or the other district.
It's a big, this is not a like, you pick this up and run with it kind of thing. This is a huge decision, but this is also a legacy decision because this is either going to create a housing authority that is a program-based sort of housing authority, or you're creating a housing authority that is in the business of trying to get housing built. Both those models exist. You know, actually,
I would be inclined to support giving the authority the power of sales tax and the power of development impact fee. And not the property tax power to preserve that mechanism more for other entities. And I do like what Sarah said, that a future board of commissioners could, or property tax money still could go to the authority via other routes.
Well, I guess I don't see why we wouldn't, because I think the consensus here is that chances are this bill is probably not gonna pass, as Lori stated.
But in 10 years.
And it maybe in 10 years, it makes sense for it to pass because housing just got way worse. So I don't see why now we'd limit that scope. If potentially in 10 years, this is an issue that's beyond what we understand now, which is crazy to say, but that might be true. And that board needs the authority to make this a priority and needs the authority to pass this as many mechanisms as they can get before we do turn into Breckenridge 2.0 and all of us are out of here because none of us can afford $1 million houses. I think that
Taxes on them.
Just the
Tax-
hazard, the
yes,
hazard
well,
is if
because-
the authority doesn't coordinate with other entities and passes and goes for a property tax, and then like say they're competing with the school district for a property tax increase.
so remind me, how did people get on the board for this?
so on this board, you would have 2 city, as we talked about, 2 county, and 3 at large. The 3 at large would be appointed by the 4 board members. And what you normally do is you accept applications for when a term comes up, you interview the folks.
So it seems like we have enough power to use this as leverage of what the hell are you guys doing? You need to talk to these people before you do something outlandish, and the power to potentially replace those people easily, at least the appointed officials, if we disagree with their tactics of going through without communicating to others. So I do.
Sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
was gonna say that might work for the current Board of County Commissioners and City Council, but the next group of you all
Right.
might not.
I'm right. I wouldn't make light of this, and I'm not saying one way or the other, like of how you do this, but this is a legacy decision because this is not something you backtrack on.
Yeah.
Whatever authority powers you grant, it's going to be too little, too late if you're sitting in your chair 10 years from now and you're reading the newspaper and you're like, oh no, what are they doing? Like, so this is your, this will be the legacy of the city council and the BOCC that is sitting here today. So this,
If I can just come and suggest something too, you do this, you establish the authority, you do the IGA, it sets all this work. The other thing too is you establish regulations and stuff. So you can set up parameters for how you go about exercising these different things too. And so again, have the authority to use it, but then you can find ways to manage it. So it's not an automatic thing that the authority does. If you will.
So that you're saying that we can set limitations on how they go about taxing property tax
Yeah,
higher?
how you could put in the regulatory scheme, how they would be able to approach each of these different aspects.
I see.
you could do like a super majority vote.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So it's not an automatic, just because you put it in there in the idea, given the authority, doesn't mean they automatically do that.
Okay.
You establish the regulations that tell them how they can do that.
I mean, with that said, I think that gives, if we set this up properly, which will be utterly important that we collaborate with people who probably will be able to think of this better than maybe else we will, but if we set them the authority and the liberty to potentially use that in the case of that they have to, then we should. And it might require a little bit more strenuous than just a 51% vote. But I think we should give them that liberty too, because we don't know what the future holds, quite frankly.
I would say no to property tax. 100%. I think, the only abstract that I was able to find in my email quickly. That would be just at 135 mils. And they're in my district, and I would say no. Because I think if we're trying to work towards building up marginalized communities and incorporate them, if we give this the opportunity to raise property taxes, the county raises property taxes, the hospital raises property taxes, they're going to feel the impact most.
I would beg to disagree, but I'll digress.
I mean, the numbers are what the numbers
I mean,
are,
I've lived
so-
there and I understand that. I have lived experience there and I know what it's like to live there. And I think a lot of this falls more on the property manager. So
No,
I,
I'm just saying, if the property taxes are increased, then eventually the revenue to compensate for property taxes has to spill over somewhere, right?
Mhm.
And so their tax assessment in that community is higher than my tax assessment. And so that doesn't seem appropriate or equitable to me if we're trying to incorporate this into the program.
The other, and yeah, we just always want to throw this out. The Gallagher Amendment states, right, that taxes your commercial property 3 times. So whatever your assessment would be on a residential property, it's 3 times as bad for your business community. That was one of the reasons we got our butts kicked in Gunnison.
One of them mentioned that you are required to have 2 of the mechanisms before you can use the third. And I cannot remember what the combination was.
It's the
but I would
impact.
just advocate for not excluding if you want to be able to pursue. I feel like that it was.
It's the impact. I think it was Jennifer that spoke to the impact fee. I would want the impact fee. Here's just a real quick disclaimer. That one is very intensive on the
legal counsel review on that because it's actually been challenged. And I was in a community there where we lost and the impact fee. And so, and I don't know, I don't want to go out on that limb and sell on the wrong branch. So, but I know that, but that's a great, Chrissy, that's a great point to put in there.
I think I asked that question and thinking that it was, you had to do both, and I know, and the response, at least from Lori or Jim, it wasn't, you had to do both. Because I was reading, I was wondering how to interpret that, but I think it's worth clarifying for sure. And I would support Cisco's proposal, and I guess Kayla's comments too, and I think we're at, like our conversation earlier was, we're at a saturation point with property tax right now, and if we increase it anymore, in the near future at least, it seems like you'd have to then put any of those, you know, the property tax or city or county would have to subsidize programs to support those that are really struggling to pay property tax, and it's kind of, would kind of turn into this vicious cycle.
The thing I would say about this is it makes your community less affordable to live in too. Raises rents. It's sort of a trickle effect that makes your community less affordable.
And I think we've experienced that too with the economic development corporation of, you know, the business climate, the 29% assessment rate already on commercial property plus the personal property that's incorporated into that with estimated gross income and all of those components that go into the valuation process makes it very difficult for a business to come to a community that has a very high property tax rate.
Is there any comments on, okay, so is there any comments on the sales tax and the 1%? Do you want to stay at a 1%? Do you want to limit the 1% to 3/4, half?
It would be up to 1%.
Yes. And the board can say, we only want to put 0.5% on the ballot. So is there any strong feelings around that? Because that is an important discussion to have.
I'd like to keep it up at 1%.
Okay.
I'll agree. I think 1%. I'm increasingly intrigued by this idea of putting in some other considerations. I'm thinking about like the supermajority idea, but even having it be, maybe this is too extreme, but thinking like to raise sales tax, I would almost want like unanimous of the two, like either the city or the county, and the funds from the other jurisdiction, like basically the supermajority of the city and county in favor of going for the sales tax.
To be clear, this is all going to have to pass through a public voting.
Yes.
Anyways, right?
Yeah.
But you want to present it in a way that it has a likelihood of passing.
Yeah. Well, and I'll be honest, we had a situation where there was several very disconsenting board members, but it still made it on the ballot. And those board members were very vocal.
Well, that's where I'm going. I mean, I would hate to have the housing authority go to war over a ballot measure with the city.
Right.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to be in a place where we're competing for priorities. Or the hospital, even, you know? I don't know.
And if you think about it, each of us that have the taxing authority, what's the likelihood that we would actually reduce? You know, because I mean, you grow accustomed to that, and you know, once you give that up, you never really would ever get that back. And so I kind of agree on the property tax, and that wouldn't necessarily go up. With the sales tax thing, you know, is that passed? You know, with the other measure that we had on that, the sales tax piece or the rental tax or something like that, it kind of incorporates the other folks that are coming in. I like that feel. I would advocate keeping 1%.
I would say also, we have seen sales taxes rise exponentially in the last 3 years. It continues to shock me. I don't know why, but
Sales tax revenue, right? Those are numbers.
awesome. So the point I'm trying to make is that's not because our locals are buying more. It's because we're receiving more tax, revenue from people outside the county and possibly because of online sales. But the only, it would seem that may continue to grow, whatever that number is. And I keep thinking it can't, and it always does.
So I just want to remind everyone that there's a good chance where none of us are going to be here when any of this happens. And those 125 mills currently at Mountain View we don't even know if Mountain View is gonna be there, quite frankly, given the talks that they've had previously with other organizations. It's quite surprised to me that they were even able to have those talks, given how we feel about our marginalized community, but I think it's really dumb to limit what they could do in the sense of not literally. I think we should have strong, very purposely built regulations on how they can do this. But we don't know what the future holds. We just don't. We don't know what they will need in the future. And I think tying their hands right now, I would hate to be the person on the newspaper 10 years from now, sitting on the couch and say, well, this person, city council member, made it impossible for us to raise property taxes so that we can charge all these 50% out of state owners who are basically living in our community, so that we can rebuild our community. I quite honestly don't have the confidence that we're going to be able to prevent a huge crisis where a lot of our homes are owned by out of state people. I don't. And that worries me that we're tying their hands in the future because of what is going on now. I think that right now we can build that board to suit our needs and make it very clear to them that we would not support any type of increase on sale or housing property tax right now. I think that'd be fine. I don't see an issue with that right now, and purposely build out that board to where it makes sense to where they can't do that, right? And intentionally bring on people who we think would support not having those issues. But to tie 10, 20, 30 years from now, people's hands from doing something that they might need to do, it seems foolish to me for the short-term gains of it. And I understand that these short-term issues are issues that we need to focus on. And I don't disagree at all. I think that raising the taxes for them, it's just not the right choice right now. It's not the right mechanism right now. But I don't see why we can't let them, with strong regulation on how they do it, let them have that availability in the future. Because mind you, this is going to exist probably after we die, quite honestly. Like, this is probably going to be a very, very, very long-term thing. And I would hate to tie their hands because right now our needs don't speak for that. So I would encourage all of you to think about it, not just for like what we're living, but our kids in the future and what the potential options we could give them, as rigorous as it might be for them to get to those options.
I think that's a good point, Christian, but in taking that tactic, I think we inadvertently tie our hands, tie the hospital's hands, and the district's hands, because property tax is the only mechanism that we have by which to ask the community for additional investment. Like they can't levy a sales tax on their own. And so I wouldn't want to tie their hands and put them in a position where because the housing authority has gone for a property tax initiative and now property taxes have raised or increased because the valuation has increased. There's not enough money for families or people living in affordable housing developments to invest in repairs or new school building or hospital infrastructure.
We're not tying their hands because we're the ones picking these people.
I propose if we want to, when we get to a point of making a decision, a straw poll instead of just facing your debate.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think we were at, I was going to wrap this up because we're at 7:35 and at 7:30 peg to finish this up so we can talk about the development side. Yes, do you want to do the straw poll of the room? So those in favor of, let's start with, do those in favor of giving any kind of taxing authority? Is there anybody that's strongly against having a taxing authority? That's a great sign.
Can research that issue of what you can do? So it is, the way it's written is if you do a sales tax or a property tax or both, then you can do the impact fee. So just, there can't be a vote for just an impact fee. You can't do that. Correct. The way it's written, if you do the sales tax or they call it an ad valorem tax, but if you do one or the other or both of those, then you can do the impact. You can't give the authority to do an impact fee by itself. I don't know why, but
I think the developer said, You know, don't do that.
Okay. Straw poll of folks that are in favor of allowing an up to 1% sales tax. Okay, any strong opinions of limiting the 1% sales tax? Wow, this is easier than I thought.
Living how?
You could say that the housing authority could only do 0.5%.
Oh, no.
Okay. Property tax?
Could you? In favor of. including
Yes,
property
and sorry,
tax
in favor of concluding the property tax.
With limits.
Okay,
What limits, just curious?
I would say no more than 1 mil, and the supermajority of city and county residents.
I fully agree with those limits.
I could live with
Joe,
that.
I can live with that.
Limits. We can compromise.
okay. So if, when we bring forward we'll include up to 1 mil. And then the impact fee, I think you include, well, all those in favor of an impact fee. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, and the reason I say that is because that's you can't, as we just learned, you can't do it without the.
As a process point, you asked who would agree to that compromise, but you didn't ask who would vote against that.
Sure. Yep, no, I don't normally run meetings, so yes. Like this. Okay, why don't we do that? Who would vote against any property tax authority?
I would vote against. any
Property
Property okay. All right, well, the reason that last conversation was so important is that this last one is, there's two really, to kind of beat around the bush on here, there's two kind of easier, I hope, discussions, and then one final discussion around a development subcommittee. The powers do allow condemnation powers of a regional housing authority. That is a sticky widget in that condemnation is, I don't even like saying the word, let alone talking about the subject, but could also put your regional housing authority in a compromised situation if they don't follow that to the T. The other big piece of the puzzle around condemnation is that is also a city council power and a BOCC power. So, you're, by authorizing a third party, you're kind of taking away a pretty controversial but important power that local government has and putting it into a board that might not see eye to eye with elected officials. My suggestion is to think long and hard about this, but from practicality standpoint, I would not suggest having condemnation powers.
I would say this: urban renewal authorities have quite a bit of domain, and from the very beginning, I actually argued maybe we should take that out, and I was talked out of that. They said you never know when you might need that, even though you don't think you could possibly ever want to do that right now. But I think the city and county have that power, and I wouldn't want it to reside in another. I think it's bad enough it resides in New York. So
The one thing I was going to say though, I've seen where sometimes it is within the housing authority that it's only exercised with the consent of the other governing entities. Like it would be with the consent of the city and county.
then why would they just go to those organizations and ask, for that to happen?
Area, if you will, that's being exercised.
And that could be both city and county in that area. I see what you're saying.
So that's an option if you wanted to include it.
I hate the thought of it.
I'm not either, but that is an option. You
Does-
can do it that way.
Does anybody have a question about what condemnation is? And
I have some clarifying questions. So if we granted the housing authority condemnation power, would the county and city lose that power?
No,
So then we would have 4 entities with that power: the URA, city, county, and housing.
Except according to what Chris said, they would only have that power if both the city and county agree.
Consent to, yeah.
Would we
So
would we
there's,
have to write that as a constraint, or is that?
No, that would be in the contract. Yeah, they could only exercise condemnation. On consent.
And could you remind me again what you said at the beginning? I think you gave us a warning or something.
It's, this is it in the plan, and when you get the plan, it's like, this is like saying the 4-letter word in a public meeting, you're gonna get fired if you bring it up as a planner. So it's not a word that I'm like, I've ever said during a public meeting, except for like right now. And I don't even feel safe saying it now. But it's a very controversial, and you probably know better than I, it actually, if you go through condemnation proceedings, property owner actually then goes and is awarded through a jury decision, with a court on what the value is. My point on that is that if you have a board that does that, they could bankrupt themselves with a decision like that.
Oh.
Yeah, because you have to take.
So Telluride kind of did that to themselves. The big condemnation case, it's like the case study for condemnation, and the reason that you're not allowed to say that as a planner is Telluride condemned a property that they didn't want to see development on, and then when they were awarded, it was like 17,000 times the amount that the community, and they're still paying it off, and they haven't been able to do anything for a long time because it bankrupted the entire town. And there's no, like, that was awarded, it was done, and Telluride is Telluride now. So they've been trying to figure out how to run it ever since. Am I wrong on that?
No,
That's the
there
case
is
then.
that possibility. I would have to say though, I expect that property to be condemned here wouldn't be quite that bad.
Yet.
Yeah.
And what does condemned mean? I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Where to eminent.
Where you have a government entity that goes in and essentially says that this property is better used, if you will, for a public purpose, so they go in and.
For the property value,
I
right?
know I'm being facetious, but that's happened. You
Yeah.
have these bit of views all across the United
Usually
States.
for like roadways, that's kind of.
Yeah. Well, and here's an example, Cisco, a real life example for Lake County. Is it something that the county considered for the Union Civic property if we weren't able to contract with them in order to take that property to build the Justice Center?
So this,
Clarify question, is that the same reason when we had that health department meeting about that one house here that was, like a mess, or like there was, there was a thing there, and is that why we didn't take that approach to condemning the property because of the cost to the county?
I don't know, but that's in combination. If you condemn property, you have to pay what is established to be the value of that property.
And then if you condemn a meth house, guess what? You own a meth house.
I know, yeah.
All right. Sorry. No, it's okay. I'm gonna get back on track though. With that discussion, straw poll vote, if we don't mind. Do we want to consider this as a power straw poll vote? Yes, you want to consider it as a power, please. raise your hand.
What? You heard mumbling.
Sorry.
So if you want the Regional Housing Authority to have condemnation power, please raise your hand.
Only if it were limited.
Right, so we put the language in there essentially saying that it's only with the express, and we've been working on the draft already. So this is the language that's in the draft, only with the express prior permission and local government within which the subject property is located to condemn property for public use. If such property is not owned by any government entity or any public utility devoted to public use, yada, yada. And also provided authority is obtained the prior written consent of the party or parties having jurisdiction over the property to be.
With that invitation, I control. Raising my hand.
Okay. Well, we can always, it's always easier to have it in and take it out later because it's a line through a piece of paper than it is.
And again, they don't have to exercise it. And then you can regulate it too in terms of how you want that consent to be pursued. So it's not, again, automatic.
And on the sales tax, I thought there was a consensus like that, the regulations that are making that choice on revenue generating sales tax or property would be, I think everybody, the room felt like those, setting those parameters around at least what was more discussed with property tax,
Yes.
also would apply to the sales tax.
Yes.
The super majority
Yeah,
plus.
some like
Yeah.
regulation of like
Regulate,
getting the city and county buying.
I think you regulate each one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Okay.
we can put that in there then. Yeah, the regulation can establish how they can exercise these authorities.
Last thing I want to talk about tonight, and I think this is important for Jackie's sanity, and the way this is formed, is that, again, as we start talking about actual development of properties, the biggest issue is that unfortunately, the city council and the BOCC can't be part of those development discussions because that they reside in your municipality and you're the judge, jury, and executioner in a quasi judicial capacity. So that makes development of property very hard if it's just Jackie. And we also heard from the folks and the question and answering around the fact that it is impossible for a staff of one to be a developer. My suggestion is, and especially in the very forthgoing, is that you create under the bridge of the board a development committee. And the reason I'm suggesting that is that development committee can come to the board and ask for funds as necessary to develop property, i.e. bring in a consultant or to do a market demand study or something along those lines that will advance a project. The board would be the fiduciary authority overseeing a decision like that. And it would allow Jackie to not, because the development committee doesn't actually have any authority to make a decision, it would allow her to have meetings with folks that have experience that are not electeds to talk about how do we leverage public assets to bring them into housing. And my thought on this is right now that given the fact that you have a staff of one, this would be a very big asset to include in the makeup. But what's important to me is that when we make the bylaws, that the development committee is truly defined and that it doesn't become an unattainable number of folks that, it's like I'm holding a development committee meeting. It's like, oh, I'm bringing Jerry and John and Joe to the meeting so they can talk for 2 hours about how you should build houses. I think it needs to be a real purposeful group so that you actually have a group that's trying to develop and try to give recommendations. Ultimately, the board has the authority, the regional housing authority has the authority to release an RFQ, et cetera, for the development property. The only other piece that's really important about this decision that I don't is where this has the most political fuzz for the two electeds is that in theory, this new regional housing authority is going to be receiving public lands, right? And they will have control over bringing projects forward. So having an independent development committee that is overseen by the regional housing authority, it has voting members saying yes or no, we're going to leverage property, gives a secondary step of really making sure that an RFQ or whatever has been vetted properly before it gets to that stage. And it doesn't, and it also, for her sake, gives your staff a professional body that has development experience to bounce ideas off. So it's not Jackie bringing a proposal to the regional housing authority without having it vetted by some folks that have done these types of projects.
So have you discussed with Jackie what a number would be she'd be comfortable with?
Well, I asked that question and the answer was 3.
All right, 3 goes.
And staff normally, so this is the other piece, you normally have staff members like the planners that, for instance, and the planners would meet with when we had a property and we would talk about the zoning, et cetera. But it removes, what's important is that because of your board makeup having elected officials, it removes you from that quasi judicial conflict and allows the housing authority to really pursue development without murking the waters for you as an elected official.
I say yes, help Jackie.
Any qualms with that? But it needs to be in the bylaws.
How would those be selections that Jackie would make?
No, I think you would have, again, you would interview and the full board would make appointments to that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Would we say that like city or county staff? At least one city or county staff?
That's up for
Land
the,
use
that's up to your decision.
So that would the subcommittee be you are housing authority board members?
No.
Or these are different people?
These are different people.
Okay.
And it does give the opportunity for folks in the community who have development experience that, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I was on the Regional Housing Authority Board and I hated it because I had to sit there and read budgets. And then they put me on the development committee and I was like, yeah, I love developing property. And I don't have to sit here and read a budget every month about like, are we going to pass, like the energy assistance program? Because I was like, I don't really care. I mean, I did, but not like the.
Wasn't as exciting as development.
No, it wasn't.
So can you just explain that if you were looking at a board chart?
Yep.
where would that fall in?
So you would have your regional development, or sorry, you'd have your housing authority board. We've already talked about a grievance committee. So that would be its own committee of board members. And then underneath the regional housing authority, you have your executive director, and under the executive director, you have the development committee. The development committee reports to the executive director, who brings the ideas from the development committee to the board. And hopefully, if you really get good at this, your regional housing authority board meets quarterly because you guys are all busy, and your development committee meets as necessary to keep projects moving forward. Then the last one thing, and we got 7 minutes left, is we talked about at the county level today, was whether or not the city and county want to use the regional housing authority as a mechanism to send as a referral agencies projects that contain affordable housing. The county was unanimous in saying, yes, that's a really good idea to have a referral agency just like CDOT. There really isn't bad.
Okay.
It's important. Yeah. I don't, they're not making a decision, and they're not subject experts. But the bigger piece of the puzzle is that it's actually, the reason I asked that is that we would typically assign to the development committee to write and with Jackie as a staff to write the recommendation forward. And what's really important actually on that is that Jackie has some insulation to the fact that when she renders an opinion on the housing, it isn't Jackie's opinion. And when a planning commission sees it, it's like, well, Jackie's just being ridiculous. It's like, no, development committee worked with Jackie on this, and this is the opinion of 4 people or 5 people. And that's what's important, because again, protecting your staff is the best I can through the guidelines of this. Any qualms with that? All right. Wow, we wrapped up. Any other questions? We have 6 minutes. I think we got through. I do have a
question real quick. The problem is, okay. We have heard that housing authorities have been acting as transaction brokers, and that has now been outlawed. And so how is that going to affect us? Because Jackie has her real estate license, so it seems like we're protected from that.
I don't know where you got that. You call it the way you do it is it's not a it's an administration fee. And so she's administering a lottery and she's assisting folks with loan assistance. What you can do is when it's in the guidelines today is that if someone wants to be represented by a real estate, they pay the commission. And I'll be honest with you, the real estate community shouldn't be trying to make the bread and butter off of affordable housing. And I will tell you that that a lot of, I've actually had real estate, they're like, for the amount of work of taking first-time home buyer through a loan, they're like, I'd rather live and breathe. So.
Clarify that issue. There was a judgment personally against Jennifer for acting as a transaction broker without a real estate license. So the workaround is whoever is doing your transactions, you make sure they have a real estate license, and then we're out of homeowner.
Or you can have your attorney write up contracts, which.
Thanks, attorney.
I need another attorney.
well, you wouldn't be the attorney for you know,
There's
but
also a movement to try to get, to resolve that issue, to try to get the Colorado revised statute to give that power to the housing authorities explicitly, so that that one judgment
Yeah.
isn't continuing to hamper housing authorities in the future, but it is not complete yet. It's just. Yes.
all right. Any other questions? Lots of pizza to take home.
I don't dare.
Well, I mean, in all seriousness, this is like, we have hit the housing calendar timeline. I do, city council, I will say we do have some anticipated outcomes from the charrettes as far as zoning recommendations. There is a timeliness around working through those, and that to hit the DOLA qualified strategy timeline, we need to be through those by September. So that is
We've been talking, about the policy advisory team's recommendations. I think they were kind of put on hold until we can kind of combine, more holistically. As an example, we've talked about doing away with R1 as a zone. Why do we even have R1? It's more of a suburban zone. And so there are a lot of things flying about.
And I think because I'm not the charrette process, I've been, just for what it's worth, I think we had 140 responses from the initial charrette. So hats off to SE Group and to Shape Architecture and Caretech. Caretech has done their analysis on potential probable costs on engineering for some of these sites. So it's, from where I'm sitting, I'm really excited. I apologize, I am not at the 20th, I'm not going to be around the 25th. They're more than capable of handling that process as far as the public involvement. But I am very excited to see the outcomes of that. And I think from the densities and the models, there's just in the very low hanging fruit, there's a 60 unit project potential coming, if we can have collaboration amongst the city, county, and potentially the school district. So it's really exciting to see this, and also with the Laurel parcel moving forward, I think we're going to be setting up for a really exciting few years of trying to get stuff done. So I applaud. I mean, we're light and fast to this stuff. So thank you for tonight.
Thanks,
you.
council.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Oh, wait, I have one more question.
Tim has a comment too.
I'm about to start throwing stuff at you.
I'm kidding. Oh, kidding. No, she doesn't.
Smoking a bear.
Someone in chat.
Oh, yeah.